So the teacher part of me wants to invite you all to have a little stretch and move around. But the speaker part of me says you have 18 minutes. So hang in there. There's a break coming. I would like to invoke one aspect of my teacher self and ask you to raise your hand if you're a parent. And if you wouldn't mind keeping your hands up, because we have a lot of people who don't have their hands up yet, can you add your hand if you are in an intimate relationship with a child? Perhaps you're an aunt or an uncle, a teacher or a coach. And because we're missing a few, could you please raise your hand if you once were a child? Yes. So I am talking to you. I want to invite you to put a picture of that child in the very front of your mind when they were newborn, when they were an infant full of hope and potential. And I want you to ask yourself the question, what were your greatest dreams, your highest ambitions and wishes for this child, even if it was you? And the question that I've been asking for the last 20 years or so is mainstream education, our schools and classrooms educating children for those capacities? I've had the opportunity to talk to a lot of parents and ask that very question. I don't know if what I've heard represents everyone here, but there tend to be common themes that come up. Parents talk about, I hope my child is happy, engaged, fulfilled. I hope they learn to be a critical thinker, to be able to create and see beauty in the world, to be able to self-reflect. My sense is that contemporary mainstream education is doing many things and working very hard and not working towards these goals. In 2010, our Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, wrote a document 45 pages long called No Child Left Behind, a blueprint for reform. And it was sort of a re-articulation of the No Child Left Behind legislation from the Bush administration era. And in that document, I think he revealed a lot of the values and goals that contemporary mainstream education does have. The word clouds are very useful these days, and this is sort of a picture with words that are emphasized or used a lot, enlarged to represent their relative importance in the document. This kind of language is what I used to call the 3 A's of education: assessment, achievement, and accountability. Now I call them the 3 A's of education: assessment, assessment, and assessment. What is missing? What is missing from our language and from our goal setting in terms of education? And here's some of what I think is missing. Here's some of what I hear is missing from parents: imagination, creativity, compassion. Now, this trade-off would be one we could consider. It could be an interesting conversation to think, well, we're going to suspend our need for our children to be happy. They can be happy later. Right now, they're learning stuff. That would be an interesting conversation if we were wildly successful at doing what it is we say we want to do. If we were achieving great heights of mastery, we could say happiness can wait. But in a recent report, and unfortunately a typical rather than atypical assessment of the relative success of public school mainstream education, 1,900 of the 2,200 public schools in the state of Washington received a failing grade in terms of the No Child Left Behind goals. Why? And isn't it time perhaps to rethink some of those goals? My sense is that part of what's going on is the education system is a reflection of the culture in which it's embedded. Our society is one that is obsessed somewhat with covering surfaces. We're engaged in races everywhere. And when we talk about education, I think we're talking about the same kinds of things. When I was a kid, we bemoaned the invention of the remote control as it created couch potatoes and channel surfers. Now we talk more about surfing the internet. But it's a lot about skimming surfaces. And I think the same is true in education, and I think there is an alternative. Depth. And I think it wouldn't be impossible to take seriously the idea that we could be educating for depth. And what you're missing when you stay on the surface of things is complexity, richness, ecology, interrelationships. This is just funny. But true. So the Common Core, which you may have heard of, the latest incarnation of this sort of obsession with covering surfaces and racing places, is the articulation of 1,500 individual and isolated age-tied skills and standards that educators now need to assess children for mastery of. And increasingly, teachers' pay is tied to the ability to document students' mastery of these 1,500 skills. And it keeps us busy. It keeps teachers very busy. It requires a tremendous amount of resources, time, in-services, textbooks, and assessment tools to cover this, what feels like vast landscape, and it's big. But in comparison to all of human knowledge, what we know today collectively, the Common Core, though not an arbitrary list, is a pretty small subset of a subset of what we could be educating for. And when you think about what the exponential rate of growth in human knowledge and what will be considered known when the kids we're working with are entering the workforce, Common Core shrinks again in its importance and scope. And if you could entertain the possibility that perhaps not everything is ever knowable by our human minds, given the limitations of our perceptions and the limited number of neurons and synapses we have, there might be something beyond knowing by us. How wonderful. Again, how important is the Common Core? Is it everything that we should be educating for? I want to go back to this concept of deep education. So I'm borrowing the term deep in this sense from the deep ecology movement of the early 1970s. Scientists at that point were getting pretty good at documenting some of the problems with the way we were treating the Earth, and we had documentation of habitat destruction and species extinction and the beginning of data about climate change. And some scientists were frustrated by the lack of anger and passion and commitment from their scientist colleagues who were good at showing statistics. deep ecologists said, we need to actually show that we care, that we're connected to this thing we study, the earth, and that we are in relationship with it, and that it matters. And I think parents and educators are uniquely positioned in a similar way to express a little anger, outrage, and passion about the children who need to be served better. Little bit more about depth. If you see a nautical chart, it's covered with numbers. Those numbers indicate the depth of the water. They're measured using a fairly esoteric unit of measurement called the fathom. Fathom is a standardized unit of measure representing 6 feet. 6 feet's been standardized, but originally the meaning of the word fathom is to embrace. The depth of the ocean is actually measured in hugs, you know? It's the human arm span. There's another meaning for the word fathom, which is to understand, you know? As in, you can't fathom what I'm talking about. The meaning of the word understand, similarly, I think, could reclaim that meaning. That when we're educating kids, we should be encouraging the embrace, right? That when you're learning something, you're opening up to it and welcoming it in. At least that's what we could be doing. So I want to give this a concept of deep education, a little bit of texture, and show it to you as a living entity. I want to tell you about a project that I've been doing with kids this fall at the school where I work. These are 9 to 12-year-old students. This was sort of a typical moment. We were reading the newspaper together to see what's happening in the world, you know. And we came across this article about a place walking distance from here that some of you probably know quite well, Madrona Point. We came across this article that included a history of this very special 30-acre spot, and I'll tell very briefly and do it great injustice by saying it has a rich and interesting history. It was originally part of Lummi tribal lands. It was used as burial site, among other things. Became part of a land grant, was bought and sold, ended up in the hands of a real estate developer in the 1980s who planned to build condos on this spot. Local citizens, perhaps some of the people in this room, got together, raised some funds, raised some consciousness, and ended up purchasing the land, gifting it back to the Lummi people with the understanding and hope that it would be stewarded and would remain accessible as a natural space of great beauty. And then, maybe 6 years ago, the land was closed as the Lummi people cited disrespect shown to the land. Recently, it's come up in the news again, and this is where we entered the story. There's now apparently some question. What is the proper ethical and legal use for this land, and how, what happens next? Students in my class were super curious. They wanted to see. They wanted to know what's all this fuss about. So we went to the edge of the spot. They were adamant that we shouldn't enter without an invitation. But they wanted to be close, so we sat on the edge, and we just sat. We took 5 minutes, 10 minutes. We sat for 40 minutes and listened and looked and tried to get a sense of the special nature of this particular area. We returned to the classroom. Students wrote poems, they drew pictures, and they had more questions. So we continued our study. We invited our local county councilman to come and talk with the students. Students were super well prepared for this conversation. They asked good questions. We thanked Rick Hughes for his courage in trying to work cross-culturally to increase conversation and collaboration. And then the kids took Rick up on a challenge, which was to write. Write with an authentic purpose, you know? To express their feelings about this spot and their hopes for the future. Kids sat together in groups, they talked, they argued, they wrestled with word choice and sentence structure. They were deeply engaged and cared and fought. And in the end, we crafted a letter, the closing for which they found from John Muir quote. Interesting. How should we close? They came up with this. Everybody needs beauty as well as bread, places to pray in and play in, where nature may heal and give strength to body and soul alike. And we weren't done. Students then were curious, these 9 to 12-year-olds, well, this is how we feel. I wonder how other people feel in the Orcas community. We should find out, you know? So we designed some surveys and they went out, clipboards in hand, and they talked to local folks, asked questions, got data, which we, of course, used back in the classroom and made graphs and analyzed. And anyway, it was a rich study, and it was one example. It was one example of what I'm calling deep learning or deep education. Deep education is happening in many places. It is happening in public school classrooms for sure. It is happening in private schools. It is happening in homeschool learning environments. The problem is, deep education is not necessarily what's valued. It's not what's earning merit pay for teachers, and it should be. Because when kids are engaged, when kids are excited about what they're studying and what they're learning, when they're involved in real questioning, deep questioning with deep experience and deep commitment, they light up. Their learning makes sense and matters. They're engaged, and the skills which are very important, literacy and math and all those things articulated by the Common Core, come alive. Last thought. There's a quote often attributed to Ben Franklin, though apparently wrongly so. It was an ancient Chinese philosopher who said, "Tell me, and I will forget. Show me, and I may remember. Involve me, and I will understand." We need to stop racing to the top. We need to be willing to take time and dive through the depths with our kids. Thanks.